I'm going to start by telling you a story. It was March of last year, and I was spending the evening in my dorm room, number 225 at Williamson Hall in Ozark Christian College, with my roommate Ian. I just gotten a couple of vinyl records in the mail that day, as I often do, so I was, of course, putting one on to listen to. And it was shaping up to be a great evening, like many others. And on this evening, I got a phone call. I checked the caller ID, and I found it was my dad. Now, this isn't unusual. My dad checks in on me all the time on the phone. So I just stepped just outside the door to take the call. But the conversation got off to a bit of a strange start. You see, he opened it with a question. He asked me, "Where are you right now?" My dad's got Live 360 on his phone. He knows where I am. So confused as I was, I said, I'm in the dorm? His next question was even stranger. He asked me, "Are you with friends right now?" And again, perplexed as I was, I said, "Yeah, Dad, everybody's here. Everybody's at the dorm. Ian's right here. I'm with friends." And that was when my dad couldn't control his emotions anymore as he proceeded to tell me that a good friend of mine who was 19 had been killed in an accident. I remember making it through the conversation and telling my roommate about it, stopping the music. I asked for prayers from him and from my floor mates, and I felt this overwhelming urge to cry. And at the same time, the moment was so surreal that I couldn't. A few minutes later, I got a call from my brother asking me if I'd gotten the news and how I was doing. His voice sounded kind of weirdly low and flat, and I could tell that he was in a similar place to where I was. I think I finally broke down later that evening, processing through my initial grief with my roommate. This was one of the first real experiences that I've had with what we all know as suffering or hurt. I'd seen suffering before. I'd seen it in the tragedies and sufferings of my friends and family, but this is the first time that it had touched my life so immediately and so deeply. Unfortunately, I had plenty of intellectual reasons that I could give for not asking the question, "Hey, why does God let bad things happen to good people, or why does he let them happen at all?" Well, I could say in response to that, God gave us the free choice between him and sin in the beginning, so that if we chose him, it would be genuine, it'd be intentional love. We chose sin instead, and so the consequences have been felt since the beginning of time, and one of those consequences is death. I could also say, well, uh, maybe God has a purpose for this suffering that my friends and family are going through. So he's a big God, so he probably has reasons that I don't understand. One of those reasons might be making my friends and family into better people, you know? And my friend was a believer, so I know I'm going to see him again. And I could go on and on about all the intellectual reasons I can make sense of my suffering and that of my friends. But in the end, none of it satisfies me, you know? Because my friends and family are great people. Why do they need a tragedy to shape them? And sure, our free will seems to include the possibility of suffering, but is free will by itself worth all of worldly suffering? And yeah, I'm going to see my friend again, but my heart aches and my stomach still drops when I talk about him because, boy, I'd love to see him alive now. And maybe there's a reason for it all, but it's frustrating not to know what it is. Maybe you're thinking something similar. Like, get out of here with your arguments, you know? What we really need is something that soothes our heart and its ache, not something that satisfies our minds. We need an answer to a deeper question. Does God care when I suffer? Does God care as a family copes with this loss? Does God care as I can't even make it to my friend's funeral? Does God care as the only substitute for my friend's presence at my brother's wedding is a vial of ashes? Again, you might be thinking similar thoughts. I need to know if God cares when I suffer through a divorce or abuse or addiction or disease or crushed dreams or broken friendships or mental illness or death. I need to know if God cares when I'm treated like an object or held up to impossible standards. I need to know if God cares in the middle of my doubt or in the middle of the things I don't feel like I can tell anyone. How do I know that God cares? How can I trust him? People the Bible was written to would have had similar thoughts. The Jews had to have wondered whether God cared that they were oppressed time and time again. Women had to have wondered whether God cared when they were treated like property. Samaritans and Gentiles had to have wondered if God cared when the God that they were told they couldn't have access to, if he cared when they suffered. There's a psalm in the Bible you can read right now, Psalm 88, that says, God, is your love declared in the grave? Is your faithfulness declared in the place of destruction? This is a psalm in the Bible. You can read it right now, and it ends by saying this: darkness is my closest friend, as if to say, it's not you, God. I think this author surely wondered, do you care at all? In response to these questions, we meet somebody in the Gospels who provides this bright, flashing yes an answer. His name is Jesus. And I want to dive into the past, the present, and the future to show you that Jesus is the proof that God cares about our suffering, okay? Jesus is the proof that God is with us not only when we process our grief in our minds, but also when we express it in tears. So first, like I said, I want to start in the past. About 2,000 years ago, a boy named Jesus was born, and he experienced life just like we do. Sure, it was in a different time, different place, but he went up against all the kinds of sufferings that we did. The book of Hebrews says that he was made like us in every way, that he lived in flesh and blood just like we did, and that he faced every temptation that we did. Now, how can this man's life show us that God cares? Because in this man, God himself came down. God himself is the one who experienced this flesh and blood human life. The creator of the universe is the one who experienced every kind of suffering that we do. I think there are 4 common types of suffering that we experience that God himself experienced in the life of Jesus. First, there's physical suffering. I don't think we need to spend much time at this at all. We talk about Jesus' physical suffering all the time, especially at Good Friday. But whatever you've been through physically, Jesus knows that pain. He knows how it feels from the smallest grapes to the ugliest gashes. And he knows the suffering of hunger, of thirst, of disease. Second, there's emotional suffering. This is where Jesus showed me that God cares, because Jesus has literally known what it feels like to receive the news of a friend's death. His friend Lazarus died of an illness, and one of our shortest Bible verses tells us that Jesus cried at his grave. And not in some stoic, quiet way. The man didn't just let one tear roll down his cheek. When we read in John 11:33 that Jesus was moved, deeply moved, and troubled at seeing Lazarus' sister cry, the word means that he was screaming, angry crying, furious at death for taking his friend away. This was knowing that just a few minutes later, he would call Lazarus out of the grave. As real as that resurrection was, Jesus still felt the anguish of that loss. There's another moment when we see Jesus going through emotional suffering of a more personal kind. In Matthew 26, he's about to go to die, and he tells his friends, I am overwhelmed. My soul is overwhelmed to the point of death with sorrow. Luke's version of the account says that Jesus was in anguish, and it compares his sweat to drops of blood. These moments remind me of the emotional suffering that many of us endure, and it shows me that Jesus knows how it feels. So we talked about physical and emotional suffering. There's also relational suffering. You ever been stabbed in the back, abandoned, mistreated? Mistreated because of something you can't control? Mistreated by those you thought would be there for you? Well, so is Jesus. Jesus was a Jewish man and a carpenter, so not only would he have been mistreated for being a Jew, but he would have been taken advantage of and mistreated in his profession. If a Roman hired him to do something, they could cheat him in any way they wanted, and nobody would have cared. More than that, Jesus was mistreated by his very people and abandoned by his friends. In Mark chapter 3, we read that his family thought he was crazy. In Luke chapter 4, the people from his hometown tried to throw him off a cliff. On another occasion, a bunch of people tried to stone him. People left his side all the time because of the truth that he said. Even the 12 guys that he spent 3 years traveling with couldn't stand the heat. Judas sold him out to his murderers. Peter denied him 3 times for fear of his own life. And all the rest of them, except for John, abandoned him as he died. These moments show me that God experienced the deep suffering of betrayal and abandonment. He knows how it feels. Now, this fourth kind of suffering was challenging to me. It's spiritual suffering. This is becoming aware of your guilt and sin and being anguish under that weight. This is feeling distant from God or feeling as if he must be distant from you. I mean, could Jesus really know that kind of suffering? How could the sinless Son of God know how those moments feel when I feel like I don't deserve God's love or when I feel distant from him? To find the answer, we got to go to the cross. See, on the cross, Jesus had all the guilt and sin of the world from all time placed squarely on his shoulders. Paul says in 2 Corinthians that Jesus became sin in that moment, though he never knew it. In Galatians, Paul says that Jesus became a curse for us. The only man who lived a truly clean life became filthy on the cross, and the Father that he had enjoyed an eternal connection with up to that point suddenly can't look at his Son because the holy God can't be in the presence of all that sin. And Jesus, in response to this, screams through the exhaustion and the agony, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Another psalm. A better writer than me put it this way. In this moment, Jesus had no feeling that God loved him. Jesus had no feeling that God pitied him. He had no feeling that God supported him. It was as if he had no God. He had the feeling of the condemned when God says, "Depart from me, who shall be punished with everlasting destruction." When you feel ashamed of your sin, when you feel like you deserve condemnation, when you feel like God has turned away from you, he hasn't. If you're following Jesus, God is not going to turn away from you or abandon you or pile shame on you. But that's only because Jesus went through the literal suffering of hell on the cross. He literally felt the absence of God's presence so that you never truly would. Whatever sin you committed, if you're following Christ, the guilt has been removed from you because Jesus felt its full weight on the cross. So there you have it. Whatever suffering you endure, you can throw it at Jesus and he'll say, "I know exactly how it feels." There are no exceptions. Isn't suffering easier to endure when you know someone who deeply understands it is right there with you? Whatever it is you suffer physically, emotionally, relationally, or spiritually, the life of suffering that God went through as Jesus can show you that he knows how it feels. He's right there with you, and he's ugly crying too. We've looked at the past life of Jesus, and I want to tell you how his life, knowing his life and knowing he's there, can equip you for your present suffering. Earlier, I mentioned that we can respond to suffering by supposing that maybe God has a reason for it, right? You know, the trusted adults in our lives might allow us to go through some kind of suffering, especially when we're younger, and often they'll have a reason for it that we just can't understand at the time. We can trust those adults who are just other flawed humans to have good reasons for allowing suffering. So is it really a stretch to imagine an infinite God has good reasons for allowing suffering in our lives? This idea isn't untrue. It's just not the first thing a sufferer needs to hear, right? But this idea can become a comfort after a long while of sitting with Jesus, pouring your heart out and letting him stand beside you in your grief. A great example of this is in the story of Joseph, who we read about in Genesis. Joseph was sold into slavery and thrown into jail for years after being falsely accused. But then he became one of the most powerful men in Egypt and saved many people from a horrible famine. If Joseph hadn't gone through all of his suffering, Egypt would have been ruined. God had a good purpose for it all. So be on the lookout. When you suffered, it might have taught you something that you can pass on. You might be able to look at yourself now and think, "I'm better because I went through that." Now, again, if you're suffering now, I would just say to you, stick with Jesus. Keep praying, keep being in the Word, keep being in this community. Rest in knowing that he's with you and that he knows how it feels. And wait on his good purposes. Although before we move on, I do want to prevent you from thinking that it will always turn out like it did for Joseph. Another Bible story we could talk about is Job. Job lost everything, his wealth, his health, his family. And throughout the book, he's saying, "God, why are you letting this happen?" He's calling God to come down and defend himself for letting this happen. And at the end, God does come and say a lot of things, but he never tells Job why he suffered. It might be the same for us. So how do we believe these two things at the same time? That God might have a good purpose for our suffering, and that at the same time, we might never know what it is. To see, we have to look to the future and to the ultimate purpose of Jesus' suffering. This is my favorite part. So we're talking about the greatest hope now that I have of seeing family members and my friend again. It's the kind of hope that the world can't give you. It's the end goal of the gospel and of God's plan. It's the end purpose of all of Jesus' suffering. This is the hope of heaven that Jesus will bring with him when he returns, and it's more real than you might think. Think about this life, the one you're living right now, the one where you go out and do your thing and learn and eat and spend time with friends and spend time alone, where you go outside and take in the beauty of nature and interact with creatures so different from us. The one where you write and draw and sing and build and play. The one where you work and hopefully find joy in it. The one where you flop into bed after a long day for some much needed rest. The one where you celebrate and dance and mourn and suffer. Heaven's not some far off place. It's going to be just like this life with three crucial differences. First, that whole mourning and suffering thing that I mentioned at the end, we'll be finished with that. Suffering will be a faded memory. One of my favorite Bible verses is Romans 8:18, where Paul says, I consider our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. If we're even reminded of suffering in heaven, we'll just think, compared to this, it seems like nothing. And it will seem that way because, second, God's presence will be immediate. God's presence will feel as real as the person sitting next to us tonight. As a result, everything we do will be for His glory. All of our work, our study, our art will turn to worship. And I happen to think all those things will be better than anything we make here because, third, we'll be made different. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that the dead will be raised imperishable and we will all be changed. These bodies that we have right now, we're still going to have them in heaven, but they're going to be made into something better. Anyone who died while they followed Jesus will be resurrected, and they'll never die again. We get a beautiful picture of this in the Bible. In Revelation 21, describes what will happen when heaven comes, and here is what verses 3 through 5 say. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and He will dwell with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who is seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. If you're following Jesus, this is the future that waits for you. This is the life that will come when Jesus returns. The only thing that's going to die is death itself. I might never know why I've experienced suffering, and you might never either. But I believe that a day will come that will make it all right. I believe that God will turn everything out for good. Can you imagine that? A life so good that makes up for everything we've been through and more? I admit it's hard to imagine, but it's what the Bible promises, and we only have that promise through Jesus, who suffered like we do and rose from the dead like we will. One last thing. As you go through this life and experience suffering, don't do it alone. I firmly believe that Jesus is always there with us, but when the time comes, the arms that you feel hug you, the eyes that you see weep with you, the mouths that you hear speak words of encouragement to you will belong to Jesus' church. It's why my dad asked me if I was with friends that night. He knew that I would need to feel Jesus' love and presence through the men on my floor. You and I have the opportunity to be that for others all the time. And when the time comes, either because God has seen you through it before, because you're just trying to be like Jesus, you're going to get the chance to be there for someone who doesn't know Jesus and they're suffering. Sit with them, cry with them, listen to them. When they see the hope you have, when they ask you why you care so much, tell them about our God who cares when we suffer. Tell them about a God who cares so much that He sent Himself in Jesus to suffer like we did in His past life so that we can be equipped to live in the middle of suffering in this life. And He promises us a life without suffering in the future. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for everything you've done for us, especially just the example of empathy you've given us in Jesus. Thank you for going through everything we've gone through and sticking with us through what we endure in this life. I pray that you'd remind us daily of the hope we have in heaven. Pray you remind us of the amazing idea that you're going to bring something even better than what we have here. I pray that as we think through this, we can be assured of your love and of your good purposes. In Jesus' name, amen.